Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second part of the Seriously event that we're running with Jonathan Clark and Dr. Ron Neller. We're going to swap things around a little bit tonight. We're having Jonathan speak first, and then we'll follow up after a little break where you can fill yourself with some caffeine and some pastries. If I leave anything for you, then we'll follow up with Ron. We won't have a question time at the end of Jonathan's. What we're going to do is hold the questions right to the end, and then we'll have a panel discussion right at the end. So let me introduce Jonathan. He's a physiotherapist by trade. He studied both Bachelor of Science and Bachelor of Physiotherapy. And he's also written a book, which I'm sure he's going to talk about tonight, which is Echoes of Jesus. Did anyone buy it last week and already start to read it? Okay, I've just started and got through the first chapter, and it's very approachable. So I really appreciate your writing style, Jonathan, and it's also just a great way to start. If you're interested in New Testament studies or textual criticism, I'd highly recommend this book. But let me hand you over to Jonathan. He's going to talk about, did the New Testament authors have a bias?
Very good, thank you.
You don't need that.
Very good, excellent. So yeah, with the book, Echoes of Jesus, it's obviously it's got a meaningful message because it's in Russian language and published in Russia. It's in the Arabic language and published in Egypt, and it's certainly changed people's lives. Or we should say God has used it. He uses anything really to change people's lives, and he's used this book, which is really great. It's written so you can give it to your non-Christian friends. It looks at questions that sooner or later everybody has. And these questions sometimes get in the way of people hearing when we quote Jesus' words. So we might think they're hearing when we say, Jesus loves you, but if they already believe that there's no way in the world Jesus said that, they're not really going to hear it, are they? And some of those obstacles that people have to hearing are very intellectual. Doesn't mean they're devoid of their emotions. You know, we're complete beings. When life gets tough, sometimes that's when we ask the most intellectual questions. And if you've got intellectual questions and you're not getting them answered, your emotions will be affected too. So it all goes together. This book is written in a very friendly, accessible way. It doesn't assume the person knows anything about Jesus Christ or history, but they want a content-rich journey of discovery that's easy to follow, logical progression. So I hope you buy a copy and get them for your friends for Christmas. I've had atheists tell me that it was the best thing they ever bought and got some copies for their atheist friends at Christmas time. Okay, what we're looking at today is, did bias distort the message of the New Testament? It's a little bit different to what Brendan said, because if the question was, were the New Testament writers biased? The answer is yes, and we can all go home until Ron gives his talk later on tonight, because everybody has a bias. There's no such thing as a person having a blank slate when they are writing and thinking about religion and politics or religio-political issues. It doesn't matter whether your religion is atheism, whether your religion is Islam, or even whether your religion is evolution. Just on that little aside, I remember the first time I read these words by a guy called Professor Michael Roos. He loudly proclaims that he was once a Christian. He's a professor of philosophy and zoology, so he's quite well qualified. And he said, evolution is a religion. In 2000, he wrote this. It's true of evolution from the beginning, and it's true of evolution today. So just when you think you're not doing religion, you're doing religion. So none of us have a blank slate. We all have a bias. So the question is, does our bias, or has the bias in this case of the New Testament authors, distorted the truth of what they wrote? So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Some people believe this so strongly to the core of their being that the New Testament has got nothing of any historical value, which is why some people can make a quote like this. Now, do any of you know who this person is? How do you all know that? Yeah, he was a famous cricketer. Now, when he said this, it was his inaugural year as a Prime Minister of Pakistan. So he had the ears of 230 million Urdu-speaking Pakistanis, and he spoke this in Urdu. Many of us here, I presume, maybe most of us, believe that when we read the New Testament, we are reading things that Jesus said and did. But obviously many people say, well, no, it was written by people whose bias was so strong there's no point reading it or even hearing anybody else say about it. So now we're not looking at bias in terms of whether it exists or not. We're trying to detect whether bias has distorted the truth of anything. And we can do that in lots of different ways. One way is to look at a statement or a description of a religion or a figure of religion and look at it from the angle of the point of view of people with different biases. So the bias are those that love that religious or political figure and those that hate them. So to make it easy for you, imagine Danny DeVito, who's the actor there. Imagine Danny DeVito has a wife and she goes around spruiking that her husband is tall, dark and handsome and a wrestler. Now Danny DeVito only comes up to about here and it's up to you to decide whether he is also dark and handsome. So Danny DeVito's wife says, oh, my husband is tall, dark and handsome and a wrestler. Somebody else comes along, maybe his ex-girlfriend or something, and says, no, Danny DeVito is short and he's not handsome, he's not dark, and he's a wrestler. So now you know one thing that is probably true, don't you? Danny DeVito is a wrestler, because that's the one thing these people with the different biases have come together and agreed with. We're not going to look at every aspect of bias tonight. There is one aspect of bias we won't be looking at directly, and that is the influence of your bias selecting material. You might remember, if you've ever read the book of John, the Gospel of John, that in the very he finishes at John chapter 1 verse 25 almost, and he admits that he didn't write down everything Jesus said and did, i.e. he selected material. We would say, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, that the Holy Spirit guided that selection criteria. But he did select. He was an editor of what he saw and heard. And he said, by the way, that if everything that Jesus said and did was written down, the whole world wouldn't be big enough to hold all the books, which is why I've got that bookshelf there, which is a bookshelf without any shelves. It's in Tasmania, by the way. Okay, so when should you be particularly looking out for bias? Well, one of the ways that you might be on extra alert is when you find out that there's something in it for the author. So if it's an obvious motive, so if I was to write about something and you knew that I was going to profit from the content of what I wrote and from its message, then you might be extra alert to whether my bias is going to distort the truth. Does that apply to what we read in the New Testament? Well, it certainly does, because most of us know that what they wrote was in no way going to benefit them. They were recording words like, if you want to be great, you have to be least. If you want to get somewhere in the world, you have to serve everybody else. You have to think of others as better than yourselves. And by the way, you're going to be arrested, you're going to be persecuted, and you'll probably be poor and you'll travel a lot. So it's not really an indication that their bias was going to be motivated by personal gain, and therefore maybe their bias isn't going to be so likely to contain distortions of the truth. When you read books where the bias has caused great distortion, you see certain things. And you see it in the movies. And most of the time we love it in movies. It's what makes a movie, to many of us, exciting, is that the bad guy's badness is really highlighted. And the good guy's goodness is really highlighted. And the hero's just so awesome. And that's, the basic theme of a lot of movies. What do we see in the New Testament? Well, let's look at what it says about the bad guy's badness. Does the New Testament writers talk about the bad guy's badness being accentuated? No, it doesn't. The bad guys back then were the Samaritans. They had enslaved Jews. They had stolen Jewish land. They were the bad guys. And yet Jesus in Luke chapter 10 tells a story about how we should behave towards others. And the hero in that story is a Samaritan. In Luke chapter 17, Jesus does an amazing miracle. Ron's going to be talking about the miracle of creation. But if you've seen some of these diseases and disfigurements, it's no less a miracle. So Jesus healed 10 people with leprosy. Leprosy is a very nasty disease. And of course, all of them were so full of gratitude, they followed him around for the rest of their lives. Is that how it reads in Luke chapter 17, verses 11 to 19? No. How many people of those 10 came back and said thanks? 1. And who was that person, by the way? A Jew? No, it was a Samaritan. So the bad guy's badness isn't accentuated. In fact, it's the opposite. So that's the opposite of what you expect when bias is distorting the truth. By the way, Australia has leprosy. I was looking through, as I do when I do these sort of seminars. I've seen people with leprosy. The last locally acquired case of leprosy in Australia that I could find was 2012. So it's not an ancient disease, and it's not that far away. You've just got to go to the north of Australia. Oh, and that picture was taken. And that picture is from the leprosy mission in Northern Ireland, by the way. Okay, the other aspect is the good guy's goodness in bias, in literature where the bias has distorted the truth, is exaggerated. Is that what we see in the New Testament? No, we don't. We see the good guys being actually portrayed as quite average sort of pathetic people. Once again, it's not the distortion you'd be looking for. And so in Luke chapter 9, verse 24, Jesus asked his disciples to go ahead and prepare the way, and they asked some Samaritans for some help. And of course the Samaritans stoned them and tortured them. No, they didn't. The Samaritans teased them something awful. No, they didn't. The Samaritans just said no. They just refused to help. So the disciples go back to Jesus and say, look, these guys have been so incredibly awful. Can you please send down fire from heaven and burn their socks off? Is that what you'd expect if the good guys' goodness was to be accentuated? No, you wouldn't expect such a horrible thing to come out of the mouths when the only bad thing that happened was that help was refused. So that's Luke chapter 9, verse 24. The good guy, I was saying to someone, sometimes you come across a PowerPoint slide and you think, I've got to put this in somehow. So if the good guy's goodness is meant to be accentuated when bias distorts the truth, then you wouldn't expect the opposite, and yet that's what we see. Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 to 46. The hero Jesus has a group of his disciples, and he says, look, can you guys, can you please pray for me? I've got a difficult thing to do, a difficult thing to pray about. And he goes away and they fall asleep. So he comes back a few minutes later, probably only 5, and they're all sound asleep. He wakes them up and says, come on guys, I just want you to pray. Goes away, comes back probably 3 minutes later and they're all asleep, and it happens a third time. So once again, there's no hallmarks of bias distorting the truth, because the good guy's goodness isn't greatly accentuated. Okay, and now the hero. Certainly the first Christians would often talk about Jesus as being someone that exemplified the anti-hero, because they were worshipping and following Jesus, but he had been crucified. But the New Testament portrays Jesus the hero before he was crucified as not being a particularly good leader or a persuader. Normally we expect our leaders, especially when they're not wielding a knife or a machine gun, to do so to lead us well because of their eloquence, their rhetoric, their ability to persuade. But we read in Mark chapter 3, verse 21, Jesus is beyond adolescence, and his mum and his siblings think that he is wonderful. No. Think that, he's just a little bit extreme, he'll wear out of this when he finds a good girl and settles down. No, they think he's out of his mind. Would you really write that if you're in the business of distorting the truth to accentuate what you're writing? No. And another classic case, Jesus as a leader, you'd expect that some people would fall away. So who's the classic person that fell away from Jesus? He wasn't able to convince to stay in the pack. Judas, that's right. But Judas wasn't the only one. In John chapter 6, Jesus feeds the 5,000. He feeds them with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. It's an amazing miracle. And then he uses that as a footstool to then talk about how he is the bread of life. And he's just talking about how you need to eat him and imbibe him. He's obviously metaphorical. They went into cannibalism or even eating the living. So he was making it very clear that you've got to lean on him. That was enough for the writer of this event to say, many of his admirers? No. Many of his onlookers from afar? No. Many of his disciples abandoned him. Many. Probably very encouraging words for the odd pastor in the world, I would think. So, once again, do we see any evidence of bias distorting the truth? I would say in general, no. Now, how do you synthesize this when you're having a conversation with someone? What I suggest is what I've experienced. Many people, when they're curious, and people I generally find love to talk about things that are important. They love to talk about something more than the sport and the weather. They just need to know that you are a listener, that you actually want to understand them. You're thinking about them, not yourself, and what you're going to say next. And that they are free to talk. You're not going to go off your handle or lose it or walk away because they upset you. And people are often willing to talk. But sooner or later, often, you'll hear them say, well, that's just your opinion, and I've got my opinion. What would you do with that? I'd go back to Danny DeVito. And I'd say, well, yes, Danny DeVito's wife had her opinion. He's tall, dark, and handsome, and he's a wrestler. But what do the facts say? The facts support the other, the ex. He's not tall, dark, and handsome, but he's a wrestler. So in the end, yes, it's interesting to know what people's opinions are, but all of us need to ask, what are our opinions based on? That may be based on experiences that are very deep. There are people here who have had their spouses with multiple sclerosis. There are other people here who have had their spouses pass away when the kids were young. So there are people here, you can talk to them about their experiences. That counts. That's a testimony to what actually is true. So that's enough about the heroes. We've got about 20 minutes left, but we're going to do a takeaway time, just like last week. I want you all to stand up. If you want to, you can do star jumps, but you've got about 60 seconds where I want you to tell the person near you, it could be a simple fact, it could be a concept, just something that you could take away tonight. Okay, I'll give you 1 or 2 minutes to either tell somebody else or to share a simple fact or something you've learnt or a new way to articulate something. Okay, I'm afraid it's time to sit down. And I encourage you to do that over the next couple of days. Ring up a friend and just tell them 2 or 3 things about tonight. And speaking things helps you to remember them, for most of us. Okay, we talked about having accounts from 2 different spectrums of the bias, didn't we? And wouldn't it be neat if we had that about Jesus? We actually don't have the opposite bias strongly represented from people who actually listened and saw Jesus. But we do have accounts that are very early on from people who witnessed and saw Christians from about the very early on. So we can tap into them. We can see whether what they saw and what they wrote about regarding what Christians believed and how they acted resonates with what's in the New Testament. Because many people believe that what we read in the New Testament is actually not representative of what Christianity was originally. They are so convinced that Jesus wasn't a very good teacher, that there's just all these little bits and pieces of information that went around and people exaggerated it and got it distorted and came up with all their own different ideas of Jesus, and there was just this hodgepodge, and that's all there ever was. And then eventually some of that got culled out. So what's really interesting, when we look at people like those who have a different bias, we're using them as eyes to see, well, is this what actually the early Christians believed? Is this what they actually did and behaved like? And therefore that's another way of seeing whether the New Testament is correct, because the New Testament talks about Christians' beliefs and what they did. So we've got a group here of these non-Christian authors who wrote about Christianity very early on. What you're seeing there is their dates of birth. So Josephus, he was born about 37 AD. So by some people's reckoning, he was born about 4 years after Jesus was crucified and resurrected. Josephus was a fascinating guy. He's an aristocrat, he was a general, he was a traitor, and a very prolific author. One of his books consists of 44,000 lines of Greek text, and his ability as an historian and what he wrote is in my book. Tacitus, he's a Roman historian who was born about AD 56, and he was a very prolific historian as well, but obviously a different bias to Josephus. And he also wrote about what he had heard about what Christians were believing and teaching. Tacitus was certainly a very thorough researcher. These aren't people who heard somebody say something out of the corner of their ear at a pub and then regarded it as history. These are people who would write about, well, I heard the conversation but only got bits, or I got it from this source. So, and they were known to research and check their evidence for some of them. Pliny Secundus, we'll skip him. He's talked a lot about in my book. Some of you might have heard of Pliny talking about how Nero persecuted the Christians by putting them on poles, covering them in tar, and lighting them up so he had some street lights. Suetonius, and the person we're going to talk about today is Lucian of Samosata. Now, Lucian was born about AD 120, and I love him. I wish I could have met him. Lucian was a lawyer. He was a travelling lecturer. He was quite well off. Who do you think is the father of science fiction? Has anyone got an idea? Most people would, it's not Lucas, by the way, George Lucas. A lot of people would say probably someone like Jules Verne. Lucian of Samosata, who wrote a big variety of literature, a big variety of books, he wrote science fiction. He wrote about being in a city somewhere near the constellation of Pleiades, and how the people or the creatures had pouches, and that's where they kept their spare eyeballs. And then they meet people, they might swap their eyeballs in and out. He was an awesome guy. Before he got to that place, he was on a sea journey, and their sea ship got swallowed by a big monster. 240 kilometres long, this monster. Swallowed the ship so intact that they all survived, and in the belly of this big beastie, there was an island with hills and trees and birds flying around. You'd think he was on Magic Mushies, wouldn't you? But Lucian also could write history. He actually wrote a book on how to write history. In fact, the story I just told you about is a tongue-in-cheek book that he wrote, slinging off at all the travellers' tales, and he called it, facetiously, a true story. And in the opening lines, he says it's not true, but it's a great story. Anyway, so Lucian, a very prolific author. We know of about 70 of his books to today. Now, he also wrote books with very strange titles, like In Praise of a Fly, The Illiterate Book Buyer. But we're going to look at a book called The Passing of Peregrinus. The passing means the death of. It's a shedding the mortal coil of a fellow called Peregrinus. Peregrinus was a con artist, and he was a very good con artist. And what makes people good at conning is, yes, it's true, you've got to be good at conning, but you've got to be able to pick your targets. So if you're a Christian, and knowing what you know about what Christians are like, but you're actually decided to leave Jesus Christ and become a con artist, who are you going to try to con? Probably going to try to con Christians. Because in general, we're generous. We'll listen to your sob stories. We like to give you the benefit of the doubt, and that is what Peregrinus did. Now, Lucian, the author of this account about the death of this man, this con artist called Peregrinus, Lucian was worried about Peregrinus. He saw him as a threat to society. And Lucian didn't have a bar of these sort of beliefs. In fact, he didn't care for any religious beliefs. He mocked all philosophy. He just seemed to make a joke about everything. I don't know whether he was a particularly happy man, because there's not much left after all of that is gone. I'd love to tell you some of his thoughts. But anyway, so he's writing this story about this con artist, and he wants to expose him. He wants people to be aware of him. But because Peregrinus at one stage had conned Christians, then Lucian had to tell his readers who the heck Christians were that Peregrinus had conned. Isn't that exciting? And he wrote this in about AD 160. So now we're getting these eyes on what Christians believed and taught. And Lucian was a thorough researcher. And in my book I talk about, just like with the others, such as Josephus, were they good at writing history? Is what they said worth reading and valid in terms of what we're doing tonight with it? So, these are some of the things he said about Christians to explain to his audience. He said that the instigator of this new religion, this cult, was a teacher and a lawgiver. You might want to have a little bit of a yawn. But not everybody believes Jesus was a teacher and a lawgiver. Rabbi Aslan, who's a bestseller today's era, he wrote Jesus a Zealot. He doesn't think that he was just a teacher. And so that is already some evidence that we could use if you were to have a conversation with someone. Well, this is why I believe what I believe. Why do you believe what you believe? It's not just from the New Testament I read about Jesus being said to be a lawgiver and a teacher. It's even the non-Christians who knew what Christians were thinking and were certainly looking for any way they could to kick the Christians to the ground. Jesus was crucified, and Jesus was crucified in Palestine. This is something I wish SBS and the BBC were aware of, because they've actually broadcast that Jesus actually died somewhere in Tibet or India. They're referring to the work of a very ancient book. It was written in 1894, so not really an ancient book, by Nicholas Notovich, who is from Crimea and a Jew, and he came up with this story, and of course it's not the truth, so it tickles people's ears and gets credence, even though we're in 2022, and we've got Lucian from AD 160. So Jesus was crucified, and he's crucified in Palestine. It also is important for other religions. Do any of you know any Rastafarians? Have any of you been to a fancy dress party and dressed up as a Rastafarian? One, very good. And maybe he particularly liked it because Rastafarians have long black braids, very thick. And any of you like Rastafarian music, like Bob Marley and the Wailers? Oh, you got to like Bob Marley. Yes, yes. People who sing with pathos, you can feel it resonating in their souls. Anyway, so Rastafarians believe that Jesus did his thing, you know, that we read about in the New Testament. He got baptised when he was 30. He taught for about 3 years. And then he got baptised in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. It all sounds great, doesn't it? But then when he was in the tomb, having died, he didn't really die, and he managed to rebuild himself. And then after that, he thought he needs to go somewhere else where people are likely to really listen, so he went to Egypt. So he spent the next 214 years in Egypt, and eventually went to a pyramid and got translated up into heaven. I wish the founder of Rastafarians had read Lucian, or even the New Testament. That would have even been better. So you can see how we can make use of history to correct people's misperceptions. Jesus was worshipped. What are some of the main ways that people view Jesus Christ today? Well, let's say 40 years ago, 20 years ago. How did people generally think of Jesus Christ? A teacher? Yeah, a nice person. He did some good things. Yeah, that was about it. Not many of them would have realised that Jesus was worshipped, just like today. Not many people realise. Those people who call themselves Christians, we actually believe Jesus Christ created the universe. He created the pond scum and the parrots and the parasitologists and the poets. We actually believe he created all of this, and we worship him. Something very different to groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe you shouldn't worship Jesus. And yet, once again, we could point to them to even a non-Christian. Christian leaders were in Palestine. I'm just watching the time. Christians were orphans and old widows. So those people who say, oh, your Christianity is just something from the West. Well, most of you probably realise, well, the Middle East actually isn't the West. Christianity is just for white-skinned people. Well, actually, they weren't all white-skinned people in the Middle East. Christianity was a religion just for all the men. Well, no, it wasn't just religion for all the men. It's just like we read about in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and in James, that some of the people that loved Jesus were orphans and old widows. Okay. Christians denied the Greek gods. There's a popular religion in Iran, and every now and again its head appears, and it's called Baha'i. And Baha'i is a religion where they believe there's been a succession of manifestations of God. So Jesus was God, but he was just one in a long line. And Baha, or Baha'u'llah, was the guy who came up with this in about 1863. So if he knew the New Testament and believed it, perhaps if he knew that even non-Christians were acknowledging this is what Christians believed all the way back, that they actually denied other gods. All of them, even the ones before Jesus came on earth. And he might have had a different point of view. Christians believed they would live forever. Jesus said in John chapter 11, verse 25, that he said that I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever believes and lives will never die. Almost sounds like a riddle, doesn't it, from the Lord of the Rings when you say it really quickly. So I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. Let's hang on to that bit. So Lucian records that this was a belief of Christians. Now, he wouldn't have just asked one or two Christians. He's quite thorough, and he would have loved to expose the fact that they had a diversity of opinions, some of them believing that there were two gods and some over 30. But no, he just wrote about this is what Christians believe. And let's put this into context. Lucian has already said that Christians believe that their leader was crucified and died. Now he's saying that their followers believe that they will live forever. That actually points to the resurrection, because every follower knows that they are not as good as the person they follow. Jesus said this in John chapter 13, verse 36, didn't he? He said, the servant is not greater than the master, or the pupil is not greater than the teacher. So these Christians are going around telling each other, we're going to live forever, but their master, their leader, Jesus, is being killed. So therefore, the only way we can make sense of that is they believe that he himself died and rose again. Otherwise, why would you be silly enough to believe that? So in a way, it's like an understanding or an admission that the Christians also believed in a resurrection of some sort. What does that mean for us? Jesus was very clear about the big picture is not this world. And so in John chapter 11, he talks about how we will one day die here, but then live forever. Not just another 40 or 70 years, we're going to live forever. He explained to his disciples that he was going to be crucified, he's going to be whipped, he's going to be crucified, he's going to rise again. You can read that in Matthew chapter 20, verse 18. And yet, he tells us in John chapter 5, verse 24, that we can cross over. We don't have to live our lives thinking that this is all there is, or that that was okay for the Christians back then. We too can take part in this incredible offer of him dying for us, which is why he talks about in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And for those of us who are very conscious of our constant sinning, it's gobsmacking how much Jesus forgives us. I've got 3 minutes, so I'd like to finish on a much more of a personal note, but not my note. Let's briefly recap. You had a takeaway section before. This last section was just helping you to see that we've got the writings of a number of authors that had a totally opposite bias to the authors of the New Testament, and yet they wrote about Christianity being the same as what we've always said Orthodox Christianity is. Now, all this for some people is theoretical. Where the rubber hits the road for some people is hearing that it's experiential. So this is a book called Hidden Thorns by Marie Rose Fox. And it's a story about her daughter who was living in Helensvale when she was brutally murdered. So it's a very heart-wrenching read. Marie Rose Fox was a Christian, and of course she had to then deal with the fact that there's a man called Adam who she knows was guilty and eventually was declared guilty of brutally murdering her daughter in her early 20s, just near Helensvale. So she could be our test case. If this is real, all this stuff about Jesus, surely there's some test cases where we can actually read about someone who is talking about where did they find the ability to forgive. So I'm going to go to page 123. So it's not early in the book. And she writes this: I looked up towards heaven. I was so angry that I shouted out, God, what am I meant to do? Adam killed my daughter. I don't have any other children. I'm at my wit's end. So what are you going to do about it? How on earth did you let this happen? You're supposed to protect children from evil. Why didn't you protect her? You could have stopped Adam if you had wanted to, but you didn't. Why? And then she talks about what she heard. And one of the things that she heard was this: I know you are angry, child, but let vengeance be mine. All I want you to do is forgive him. All I want you to do is forgive him. Leave the rest to me. You can probably imagine her response, because she was on her wit's end. She had been going through this for years already. This is about the time of the court case. So she said to him, what do you mean forgive him? I can't do that. He killed my daughter. It was brutal. Just do it. God's answer was firm and final. I knew I had to be obedient, and in that instant, my way of thinking changed dramatically. And these are now her words to herself. Who am I to hate this person? I suddenly realised, if Jesus can forgive our sins and willingly offer his life for us on the cross to give us eternal life, how can I profess to be a Christian and not forgive my daughter's murderer? It became very clear to me that what God was asking me to do was a mere drop in the ocean compared to what he and Jesus Christ had endured on the cross to pay for our sins. I needed to do it quickly and willingly. After all, I'd never professed to be a saint. If I needed forgiveness for my sins, so did Adam. So I hope this strengthens this talk tonight, helps you know the reality of Jesus, even though sometimes you'll go through life where your feelings are low. Maybe you'll remember that there aren't any good intellectual arguments against what we read in the New Testament. Maybe you'll realise this story from Marie Rose Fox, or maybe some of you have got your own stories about you had to lean on Jesus Christ to forgive an Adam in your own life. I'm sure some of you do. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Ron.